It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest speaker, Dr. Chetan Chathani, who is an assistant professor in the Inequality and Human Development program of the School of Social Sciences, National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. Dr. Chetan has a PhD in development geography from the University of Sydney, and he's done postdoctorate work at the Georgia State University. Chetan's research and teaching interests include migration and urbanization, food and nutrition, livelihoods, gender and social policy, and how they relate to the development, particularly in the Indian context. He is the author of a book, Migration, Food Security and Development, Insights from Rural India, published by the Cambridge University Press. Chetan has done extensive fieldwork in remote parts of India, and his research uses primary field-based insights to engage and inform larger issues in development. He's worked on several national and internationally funded research projects and published several articles in journals such as World Development, Global Food Security, Gender, Place and Culture, Economic Geography, the Journal of Peasant Studies, and the Economic and Political Weekly. Chetan, it's really a pleasure to have you here, and we really look forward to your lecture. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amrita Datta, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to do this lecture. Very happy to do it. What I thought I'll do in this talk today is share some recent research I have done on the role of migration as a livelihood strategy among rural households in India, and how does that relate to well-being outcomes. What I'm going to talk about today is a part of a larger research project that I worked on with two other colleagues, Jan Neyman at Georgia State University and Robin Jan Wandone at the University of Amsterdam, on India's rural-urban transition that looked at questions of migration, urbanization, development in remote rural parts of India that are witnessing a rapid and profound change. And what does it mean for livelihoods at these places, the economies, social relations in terms of class, caste, and gender? And migration, of course, has been very central to rural-urban transition, not just in India, but everywhere in the world. In fact, migration is key to rural-urban transition, history tells us. But the kind of migration we see in India is very, very different from what is postulated in dominant theories of migration, urbanization, and development. And I'll share some of that. So I'll draw on this work, which is a case-based primary field research. But I also want to place the question of livelihood, migration, and development in the wider context of the economic change underway in India, particularly following the reforms since the early 1990s, and how this economic transformation is reshaping rural livelihood trajectories, migration patterns, the magnitude, the significance of this change, and so on. So, in a sense, combining both macro and micro pictures. Now, to start with, the dominant discourse on rural migration, the prevailing academic and policy discourse on migration, not just in India, but in many developing countries, is rooted in this paradigm of sedentarism. That views rural populations as being immobile, who depend solely on land and agriculture for their economic needs. And if they move out of their villages, it's because of the distress, and that they don't have any other option but to move. In fact, one of the measures to evaluate the success of many rural development programs is to what extent they can control migration. Now, not surprisingly, in terms of policy, the prescription tends to be or tends to revolve around sort of controlling migration by improving local livelihoods and living conditions in villages, or to quote a leading economic theorist, Michael Todaro, bringing city lights to the countryside. But the field-based research on rural livelihoods, including work done by Dr. Amrita Datta in Bihar, shows that migration is an integral part of rural households' livelihoods in rural economies, agriculture, which tends to be a key source of livelihood. It's cyclical and doesn't really provide employment all year round. So households have traditionally engaged in migration as a way to supplement the farm incomes. So labor migration is a part of um, diverse, broad livelihood portfolios. And yes, in many cases, migration does represent a forced livelihood response. For example, for households with little or no land, but it's also often a deliberate strategy by others to optimize income and well-being. From both rural and urban, farm, non-farm sources. And similarly, the outcomes of migration also vary. So, in other words, migration decisions and outcomes are more complex than the paradigm of sedentarism, allows us to understand. And therefore there's a need for a perspective that sort of situates migration as part of local and diverse livelihood strategy, then merely a response to distress. Now, coming to India, just to give you a broad idea of the work-related migration that we have in India. So there are two broad patterns we see. One is employment migration by the better off section of the population from rural, regional, and smaller urban towns to cities. This is more of a permanent migration. It's a migration by migration for skilled work by educated section of the population, and it typically starts with migration for education, which then culminates in an employment. Earlier streams that we had involved people moving or people moving for government jobs, but now a lot of jobs are in the booming private sector. Now, this migration continues largely unchanged, except now you have a lot more migration for private sector jobs, which are increasingly more remunerative. Um, and its impact also on well-being also largely remains the same. So people with a better education and skills, find jobs in large cities, settle there on a permanent basis, and sometimes also move abroad. But this is a very small fraction of the overall employment migration that we see. A bulk of labor mobility in India, or a greater number of migrants are low skilled, less educated workers engaged in various informal jobs, such as working as food and vegetable vendors, security guards, construction workers, and so on. And because these jobs are also highly unstable, this migration is not permanent, but seasonal, circular, remittance based, and depending on the work that is available. And For migrants, the work destinations don't, they don't matter as much, but it's driven by where they can earn more money, and send remittances home. Of course, social networks are also important in sort of determining where do the migrants go. And what I'm going to talk about is this category of migrants, the low skilled workers, engaged in formal jobs. Now, also to the issue of why poor people migrate, the larger macro context, if you like, is highly unbalanced spatial development or spatial inequalities, regional inequality. And these inequalities are the heart of the migration that we see today. Of course, regional inequalities are not new. They have been a fundamental feature of development in India. But in the period following independence, the development planning was cognizant of these spatial disparities in development, and there were policy measures that were undertaken to address spatial imbalances. Of course, these measures were not always successful, and they hurt growth. But there was a policy effort to address inequalities between regions. Now, but what we see post 1990 is we have high economic growth. So if you look at the data, it tells you for since 1990 till 2020, 2022, the latest number that we have for 30 years, 32 years, we've grown at an average rate of 6% per annum. So a high and sustained economic growth for about 3 decades, but there has also been increase in the inequalities between different places in terms of interstate differences. Employment and income have come to be concentrated in advanced states in the south and west, while the already laggard states in the north and east have fallen further behind. Within the states that have witnessed economic growth in the south and west of India, this growth has been highly city centric, in occurring in large and concentrated in large urban center, um, creating wide disparities within within these states. For example, Karnataka, where I am, you have Bangalore, that is a global city integrated widely in global economic circuits through IT, but also you have a few hundred kilometers north of Bangalore, a district called Yadgir, where, according to census 2011, 90% of the households didn't have toilet facility, in this premise. So these, inequalities are not just between states, but also within states in more advanced regions. What is also important to note that this urban centric growth that we see in the post 1990 period has favored particular kinds of occupations, or occupations that are capital and skill intensive, and created very few formal sector decent remunerative jobs, such as those in IT, banking, finance, and so on. And most jobs are in the precarious informal sector. What that means is that it has prevented a large majority of countries' population to gain from this high economic growth, as equitably. Um, on the other hand, you also see economic reforms and the structural economic change has also diminished the significance of agriculture sector as a source of employment and income, which has then resulted in massive shifts of employment out of agriculture. The numbers that we have from official sources tell us that between 2004 and 16, there were 35 to 40 million fewer farm workers. Um, um, and if you consider the fact that livelihood in India are constructed in the context of a family in rural India, particularly in the context of a family and with an average household size of five persons, the effects of this transition of shift of employment out of farming extend to the families of farm workers involving hundreds of millions of people, and the analysis that we've done shows that this transition is a lot more pronounced in states in Gangetic Plain, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Jharkhand, which have hitherto been agrarian and remain so, but they are also witnessing significant pressure on livelihoods. Now, this trend of shift of employment out of agriculture parallels a significant increase in labor migration. The official number that we have on work-related migration from census there is about 45 million migrants, but they official sources don't capture um, uh, fully the kind of migration that less skilled, poor population engage in, which is seasonal, circular, repetitive movements. And so the other estimates that we have tell us that the numbers are likely to be an upwards of 100 million internal migrants only. Um, and importantly, all the large scale data that we have, in India, official data sources, as well as important field based work, tell us that there has been increase in migration. uh, on the other hand, you also have increase in the international migration, particularly involving low-skilled workers to countries in Persian Gulf. So you have about 9 million people working in Persian Gulf. These are semi-skilled workers, drivers, welders, construction workers, and so on. And a lot of this migration also is from states such as Bihar and UP increasingly. So, the Indo-Gangetic states that witness a lot of internal migration, and also places that see international migration, particularly the India Gulf corridor, which was once dominated by migrants from Kerala. But this is now changing. Um, Now, these two large trends of employment, a shift out of farming, and increase in labor migration, they are certainly related. But there are questions that remain. First, what is the role of migration in the present day livelihood strategies of households, how significant migration is, not just in terms of numbers, which I presented, but in terms of its effect on household sort of well-being, which is again the second question: how does it affect household well-being of those who engage in migration? And these questions require data analysis at finer scales and a theoretical or conceptual approach that considers sort of these both macro level changes or as well as the micro realities of people's life. And for that, we think that sustainable livelihood framework provides an important conceptual slash theoretical tool. This is a framework that was propounded by Robert Chambers and Gordon Conway in a discussion paper in 1991, 1992. Um, and what it does is it moves beyond sort of the econometric models on migration that are premised on the rational individual actors, like migrants being rational individuals who sort of move in response to wage differentials. Where the focus tends to be on individual. And what livelihood approach does is it focuses on household as a whole. It sees individual as a part of household who have shared interests. This in that they are similar to the new economics of labor migration that sort of also sees economic decisions being made in the context of a household. But what sustainable livelihood approach also does is it also places a lot of emphasis on the changing external conditions, such as employment options, wage structures, and so on. As I said in the beginning, in India, since 1990, there's been a profound economic change. So, in terms of sort of how this approach helps, it allows us to engage with that change in terms of the decision and the decisions that households make. Um, um, the livelihood shifts allows us to place these livelihood shifts in a wider policy context. Now, also the strategies that households devise, for their income livelihoods are also there's an attention also given to a question of resources or what this approach called assets that households have at their disposal. So, as an example, if a household chooses to engage in migration, they require what is called migration capital, which is the financial resources to bear the initial cost of migration, the social networks that sort of provide them the information on where to move, where there's work available, and so on. And then the approach also allows us to evaluate how the livelihood strategies or response that households have. How does that relate to their well-being? So it enables you to assess well-being in concrete terms, and also one can choose different measures of well-being, food security, income, women empowerment, and so on. And finally, this approach also strikes quite a fine balance between structure and agency, which is something a lot of the migration models I mean, they either choose one or the other. But here, households are seen as agents acting in a policy slash structural environments. So even if they face structural constraints, they have agency. So in other words, it avoids the excessive voluntarism that you see in rational choice kind of approaches to migration, but also avoids the deterministic tendencies of more structural theories on migration. Now, um, to come to the research that we did, as I said, and before I come to the finding, let me just lay out the strategy that we followed. So this is, as I said, part of the larger research project on India's rural-urban transition, which involved primary fieldwork. And for primary fieldwork, we chose two states of West Bengal and Bihar, and within those states, we chose two sites, and these sites were in Murshidabad districts in West Bengal and Siwan in Bihar, and and we did analysis of census data, geospatial analysis to of indicators pertaining to rural-urban transitions or places witnessing urbanization not being captured in official data sources. But one of the key indicators that we use and which is relevant, for this talk is we focused on settlements that show shift of employment from farm to non-farm jobs. And um, um, and so let me show you these sites. We again within sort of these districts in these states, in Bihar we focused on, we did a fieldwork in Barharia, um, and in Lalgola, we did in West Bengal. This was the fieldwork was done in Lalgola, which is in central part of the state. The red dots that you see in this map are villages that have 75% or more of male workers engaged in non-farm jobs, which also tells you about sort of this transition and where it is concentrated. As I said, it's a lot of it is happening in the Indo-Gangetic belt, and that is where we did our field work. Now, if you zoom in, this is how Barharia looks like. It's about 6 settlements, all clustered together, with a total population of 15,000 people, density of about 2,000 people, and non-farm workforce of 80%. Uh, um, uh, Lalgola is 7 settlements, again, all joined together. The population here is 90,000 people, so, a much bigger settlement than Barharia. Again, the density of 5,000 people or more, male non-farm workforce of 80%, and so on. Now, for primary field work, this was done in 3 stages. We did reconnaissance or preliminary field visits, a couple of them at each site, and before that, we actually visited a dozen of sites in both Bihar as well as West Bengal to then narrow down on these two sites where we did again preliminary field work, which was followed by surveys with about 330 firms and 645 households. Um, and later, after analyzing the data from survey, we also went back to these sites for unstructured in-depth interviews with a smaller sample of households as well as key informants. And in the course of data collection and analysis that we did, we found that these two sites, while sharing important commonalities, which was the reason why we selected them, also differed in many respects. So what I'll do is present a bit of a comparative analysis of the data that we collected, and then reflect on the broader significance of these findings, as the rural-urban transition that we see is not just happening in these two sites, but also in many thousands, actually thousands of villages in across India, as I showed through that map. Now, To start with, the field data that we collected, it confirms the declining significance of farming, farm work at both sides. Less than 9% of the household had main breadwinners that were engaged in farming. The shift in Barharia in Siwan, Bihar, was more recent and more rapid than in Lalgola. So Barharia has about twice as many breadwinners, main household main breadwinners who were engaged in farming before, but no longer, and many more were in farming a generation ago. If you consider the question on the fathers were in farming or not the main breadwinners. In other words, the shift of shift out of agriculture in Lalgola occurred much earlier than in Bharharia, and the other data that we have on household size, a number of prevalence of nuclear families also showed that families in Lalgola were smaller. There was and more nuclear than in Bharharia, which again tells us that Lalgola has been in transition longer. Uh, and importantly, we also observed that the shift of employment out of farming notwithstanding, land remains important. About 70% of household in Barharia own land, and about 35% in Lalgola. And again, these numbers also suggest that the Lalgola has been in transition longer, and Baharia's transition is more recent. Um, but land holdings were generally small. Little over 10% of the household had land size of an acre or more, which is which is not sufficient to derive meaningful income gains. And a land was part of the dynamic livelihoods. It served an important food security function. It was an insurance for future needs, and also, a marker of social status. So households sort of held on to a land. But this was land was not something that, or even agriculture that they, the households derive majority of the income from. Um, and so a lot of it was non-farm livelihoods. Now, we did find that many households who had breadwinners engaged in local non-farm economy of these places, working as construction workers, hawkers, running small businesses, and a very small fraction also as engineers, teachers, and so on. But on the whole, the non-farm economy, the opportunities there were limited. It was not able to absorb all workers, and migration provided an important alternative source of livelihood in the wake of shift of employment out of farming. Nearly half of the households, 46.1% to be precise, had migrant members, and one third of these migrant households had more than one migrant. So it tells you the significance of migration at these places. In terms of what was the kind of migration? So Lalgola witnessed mainly internal migration, with workers increasingly coming to places like a place in the south of India, in Bangalore, Kochi, Hyderabad. The site in Barharia, Bihar, migration from there was a mix of internal and international. International migration mainly to the countries in Persian Gulf, where many of the migrants, actually, almost all the migrants worked as semi-skilled workers, welder, construction workers, and so on. And internal migration from Bahrain was was some of it, of course, to the south, but it was quite a bit of it is Mumbai, Delhi, so very well established streams. Um, and at both places, migration was not permanent, non-permanent, circular, and it involved men. Some a woman from West Bengal side, Lalgola, did migrate, but it was predominantly men. Now, this temporary migration is not new. It's traditionally formed a key component of livelihood strategy, as I said in the beginning. In fact, a research by scholars such as Chinmay Tumbe shows that there are places in India, regions covering about 200 million people, that have witnessed persistence, remittance-based migration for over 100 years. Then you have Arhan Dehan's work, also in Western Bihar, that shows that you see this non-permanent migration even when opportunities to move more permanently were available, when work was more regularly available. Anand Young's work, is a history professor, who's again also done research on Western Bihar, which is one of our sites, one of the broad regions. He showed that migration was prevalent in that region, and he called the migrants as optimizing peasant migrants who move for to earn extra incomes outside the peak farm season, without incurring, so on a short term, without incurring the cost of migration, particularly in terms of the separation from the family and community that permanent migration entail. Now, so one might ask, so what's new about migration if it's been there for hundreds of years? Why are we even discussing it? Well, our research shows that there is one important change, significant change, also in many ways, and that is that migration is no longer seasonal, in that it is not tied to the agriculture cycle that a lot of the previous research reported. Um, it is now what we call permanent circular migration, which occurs increasingly outside the agriculture, in that male workers from these villages now spend a large part of the year away from these villages for work, even if they remain embedded in rural society, and as I said, land remains important. Now, um, coming to the other question that I raised, of how do these shifting livelihoods affect the standard of living or well-being outcomes? So the outcomes varied widely by social background, so caste, religion, land ownership, migration status. But since we are talking about migration, what we found was that the households with international migrants in Barharia fared much better than those with domestic and non-migrants, because the remittances, the amount of remittances that international migrants were able to send or bring, uh, and this is in Lalgola, where we see a lot of almost all of the migration being domestic migration. Migrant households were actually worse off than non-migrant households, and this is revealed by the data on household income. This table here. And other indicators of well-being that we have on the assets that family owned, food security, whether or not they had toilet in the premise, and so on, also showed similar results. Now, what this tells us is that it seems that the domestic migration is a sort of strategy um, for poor households, while international migration provides an opportunity for economic advancement, also social mobility. Um, and we see that a lot in Bahariya, where there's also process of social change in terms of sort of communities being marginalized before are becoming more significant at the same time, while domestic migrants don't fare as well as the international migrants, domestic labor migration does provide an important livelihood strategy for those who are facing agrarian decline, facing agrarian distress, and so on. Now, some conclusions, some broad sort of reflection on what does this mean. First, what we see is the shift of employment out of farming is a lot more significant than is often acknowledged by academic and policy making communities in India. Second, given that the local economies of many of these places witnessing rural-urban transition, as was the case in Barharia and Lalgola, migration more than ever offers an important route for many households to not just sort of cope up with the agrarian distress, but also in many cases improve their lives and livelihoods in the long run. Um, and the seasonal migration that we saw that characterized rural livelihoods is now changing in character. It is now acquiring a more permanent form of circular labor mobility. It is circular still because these migrants engage in semi-skilled jobs that do not often provide an opportunity for them to carve out more permanent urban lives, or of course, the migration in the Middle East is also there are restrictions on permanent settlements, and there also uh, gains, of course, from international migration are higher than domestic migration, but domestic migration still, provides an important strategy for poor household, as I said. And what does it mean in terms of policy? I think what we need, what this research tells us, is that there's a need for policies that stimulate local economic restructuring and create livelihood opportunities in places. But if if they're not available, policy should also then facilitate labor migration instead of sort of trying to control it. Um, and this is the paper we've reported these findings. If there is interest, there are also other papers. There are also questions of how the circular migration is also fueling local non-farm economy in these places, particularly in Barharia, where you see the quantum of remittances being much higher, and also instigating process of social change in terms of role of women, in terms of class, and so on. I'll stop here, and once again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Chetan, for taking us, through first the overall context of, India's development experience, and then taking us through your very rich empirical work on livelihoods and migration. So, and showing us how the transitions out of agriculture have really been, far more rapid than conventional data sets tell us. And also, what's very evident in your work is the differentiated impacts of migration by disaggregated migration streams like you show, very, very different outcomes for streams of internal and international migration. And and also, I mean, giving our students some sense of how you did how do you did this research, how this primary research was done. That's also going to be very helpful for them. So thanks so much, Chetan, for taking time out. A quick question, right? So basically, you find that migration has become more longer term, but it still continues to be circular. So then, and you're really working on this separately as well. What implications do you think does this have for India's urbanization project? Because the urbanization project is linked so intricately with the development project, right?
So there are a few implications. One, of course, is that because of the circular migration, we don't see urbanization proceeding at a pace it should proceed. I mean, despite 3 decades of high and sustained economic growth, we only have about 32% of India's population that is officially classified as urban. And of course, there's research that shows that it is because these migrants are not able to find a foothold in the city in terms of livelihoods, and so on. Um, but there is another side to urbanization, which is that urbanization is not being recorded adequately in the official data sources, right? In fact, what I presented today was about migration and livelihood, but this project, of which this research was a part of, was interested. The key question was what is happening, to urbanization in India, and we were interested in urbanization that's happening at the lower echelons of India's urban system, what we call rural-urban transition. Now, these are villages that are that are increasingly exhibiting urban characteristics, but they are not recorded in the census as such, because the definition in India that we have of urbanization, is particularly the census towns for smaller places, is a bit is considered stringent. So it has to, for a place to be classified as urban, it has to have a population of 5,000 people, density of 400 or more per square kilometers, and male non-farm workforce of 75% or more. And the places have to meet all three criteria simultaneously to be classified as urban. Now the trouble is that census boundaries are arbitrary, right? So the clusters that I showed, settlements Lalgola and Barharia. Now, with a population of, they're all clustering in space. You don't really see that there's any. These are separate places, but all of this is counted. Lalgola has 90,000 people, density of 5,000 people, non-farm workforce of 80%, but all of that is counted as rural. So that's another thing. But also this migration, right? What we find is migration and remittances are also fueling, this growth at the rural-urban transition, in terms of sort of built environment, livelihood shifts, and so on.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Chetan. And I think your work really, speaks to, the new economics of labor migration, livelihood studies, but also the changing definitions of urban and rural and urban, all of which is so closely linked with the course. So I cannot thank you enough for taking time out today to do this course with us. We are very grateful to you. Thanks a lot, Chetan.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.